welcome, Lipta. So maybe a short introduction. Your role at BNP and...
Yes, thank you. Good evening to everybody here. I'm Lipta Mahapatra, and I work at BNP Paribas at the Cash Management Competence Center. And just a bit more about myself, while I started my career in Treasury, then I took the shift towards banking. I have been working on APIs in banking for the last more than 10 years. Started with Asia Pacific and now with BNP Paribas Group.
Okay, today we will talk about the way to unlock business value with APIs. So, do you have some slides to present?
But we can take questions as well, yeah?
Okay, up to you. So, but if you have slides, or we can start maybe just to set the scene and to explain.
So if we just look at API as a technology, it is not something that is new. It has existed for a very long time, since the 90s. But if we see what has changed is the way it is being now used in the corporate to bank context, right? In terms of connectivity, and that brings me to the main part, where the APIs are being evolved to an extent that it is not looked upon just as a simple connector, where a corporate and bank could connect to each other, but it is more looked upon as a strategic tool, right? Before we talk more about the impact or the business value that they present, we must address that the beginning of APIs, so to say, in banking started with PSD2, especially in Europe. But it was a starting point where it started that what we could do in terms of open banking. Though we know that PSD2 APIs for account access, it's more retail-oriented. But it paved the way for the corporate banking side as well to ensure that what is the value they could bring in terms of connectivity and terms of business for the corporates. Coming to the part where it is being looked upon as strategic tool, I would like to give an example that we implemented a few years ago with an insurance company, a French insurance company, where the claim disbursement, right? So the final claim payout process, once the customer of the corporate would file a claim, it took about 2 days because it was a complete manual process. What the corporate did, they revisited the entire manual process, and this is something that in the beginning we touched upon, the importance of looking at the process itself and making things that would making the changes or the levers that would make impact. In this particular case, the corporate looked at the claim process, they digitized it, and the last mile was a SEPA inst payment, which was done with the bank, right? So this is where the value came, that they converted a manual process to an automated process, so you're eliminating manual error. But the main value proposition that you tell in the market to your market is that, hey, if you do claim insurance with us, your claims get settled instead of 2 days in 5 seconds, right? So it was the hidden value that came out, and that's where API changed the flavor or the game for the corporate. Just from a simple tool for connectivity, it translated into something that is more strategic in nature, right?
Could we say that, because at the early days of PSD1, PSD2, and now we are reviewing PSD2 and working on PSD3, so, and I keep thinking that open banking was quite, for once, regulation was ahead of technology, and so APIs, could we say that it's a sort of key to unlock open banking? And do we have headroom, I guess, for improving and to a better use of open banking?
Yeah, absolutely, and you said it perfectly, because if PSD2 guidelines or something didn't exist, then as a product, I would be having a very difficult discussion with my security, right, to be able to expose those kind of services. But because PSD2 came in, it laid a standard in terms of authentication, security, what needs to be done, and what is acceptable in the market, right? So it clearly paved way to make inroads for API-based connectivity, because it's real-time, on-demand, the opportunity is immense, right? So it clearly did.
Yeah. So you see more and more, and I know that at BNP you're quite keen to develop a sort of case study or use case with customers, and you try to replicate, so to have a sort of lab where you test with a customer. And so to have what you like to call co-creation.
Co-creation.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's something that you propose to customers. Okay, you have an issue. Let's try together with the bank to see if we can use via API, a sort of interface. Let's put it like that. A way to build a report or.
Yes. So I would put it slightly differently. I would say that technology by itself is very neutral. It means nothing, right? But if you link that technology to a problem statement, which comes from the corporates, then it is much more powerful. And that's where the real innovative value comes in. So to be honest, when APIs were launched in the market for banking especially, it was quite a bit of a hype, right? Saying, okay, APIs will change the world, everything will be API related, right? But eventually we saw the shift from the corporates who were very pointed in their discussion, who said, I want to use this for a specific solution, right? That's where the co-creation part, and I will explain a bit about co-creation. This is where under the Treasury Lab, we as a bank, along with our corporates, get into a research-oriented discussion about a problem statement that could be solved by a bank. And it is a way to also optimize the R&D investment on both sides, the corporate and the bank, so that you're looking at the right ideas, the right solutions. And many a times it happens that, okay, it did not work out, or maybe the industry is not yet ready for the solution. So then you move on and you pick on the next problem statement. So totally, definitely, that's a kind of a dialogue that we have under co-creation with our corporates.
And in cash management, trade finance at BNP, what are the technologies? Because there are many technologies. We talk about TMSs, a lot of fintech, APIs, AI, or Gen AI, etc., machine learning, blockchain, DLT. What are the, let's say, the critical, let's say, technology that can enable corporates and treasurers, especially in this turbulent time where we need to be more, let's say, real time for everything? What will be the emerging technologies, or maybe a bit of all?
Yeah, it's a combination of all, I would say. But let me take it a bit of a, since we were discussing a bit about fraud, so I thought let me add a bit of a flavor to that. Because for a corporate perspective, fraud detection becomes very important. And as Paul rightly mentioned, that if you are a payment hub, you would have a lot of payments going through, be it payroll, or be it your supplier-related payments. So it's very normal that you would like to harness the power of Gen AI to do pattern and trend analysis, to ensure that there is a watchdog, a strong watchdog, watching things. What Gen AI has made possible today, which was not the case earlier, because earlier it was quite linear, what you would be left with is some kind of reports, and then it's up to you to decode those complicated reports. With Gen AI, what it has made possible is that it synthesizes and consumes large volumes of information, data points from multiple sources, applies its own logic towards it, and explains to you in terms of actionable insights in a very simple language and also in the language that you want. What could go as a next step, which is being called as agentic AI, is to take a step and act on it, right? So Gen AI just by itself is just as an observer in itself. You're just observing. And just taking an example of supplier payment, yes, it detected that it's asking to change the bank account details. You would like to take a step ahead and go outside your corporate environment, do a verification of pay via API with your bank, which an agent could do. So that's where the combination of technologies, so there you are blending two technologies, Gen AI and API together to make it more powerful, right? So just with linking multiple technologies, but again to achieve a problem statement where you're observing insights and also acting on that insight using API makes sense.
But as we are multi-bank users, so if we develop something with BNP and it works, how could we, let's say, try to generalize the system with other banks? It's something that could
and that
be
is
developed?
actually my next slide.
Okay, so sorry, I didn't know.
So which is, and you rightly mentioned that as a corporate, you would say that, yeah, I work with multiple banks, like 5 to 6 banks. So if I'm doing connectivity with you, what about the other banks? Do I have to do multiple times the implementation? which is where the industry, at least the SWIFT, they have come up with standardized API specs for reporting. And there are some banks who follow the reporting specs, because especially in Europe, we love standardization. So in that aspect, but at the same time, there are also a bit of fragmented model, right? The infrastructure, not only on corporate side, but even on multiple banks, it becomes fragmented. So there is a new model that has emerged, which calls itself aggregator, and it lies between the client's corporate system and the multiple banks, right? So this aggregator then acts as a unit, which would aggregate the services across multiple banks and provide to the corporate.
At Swift level? Or?
No, it's a fintech that would do that. But this market is much thin. It's quite thin as a market, and the model is quite new. Swift could also do it. But at the same time, with Swift, we also look at cases which are beyond Swift corporates, right? So not every corporate is a Swift corporate. So these aggregators then partner with those corporates to provide the service across multiple banks.
And not all banks are offering Swift services. So we're still connected with some German banks with EBIX. But so it's interesting because you know when you will select a new bank, launch RFP for selection of banks, this technical spec will be quite precise to make sure that the bank you will select will be able to deliver the type of information.
And the number of times we get that, like it's quite a heavy section.
Yeah.
So I could say that at least 1 in every 3 RFPs that we see, they have very detailed sections regarding API connectivity.
Exactly.
So
it was my point. I have the impression, discussing with different banks, and we have many banks here, that RFPs are more detailed, bigger, more questions, so just because of this technical aspect. But when it comes to connectivity, do you think that API will help simplifying, because bank connectivity is still an issue, so depending on the way and the channel you use for being connected, so do you think that API could be the sort of panacea for getting, especially for mid-cap and smaller companies? We have a lot of companies having less than $1 billion of turnover, so they would like to be connected. Okay, no, with all of respect for multi-line, or the local, let's say, connectivity solution, it's better to have a sort of cross-border and multi-connectivity solution. So maybe API could be a solution, you think?
Especially for the mid-cap corporates who are not very dependent, especially on TMS providers. For them, typically we see that they use their own proprietary tools, where integrating an API becomes much easier for them. Because if you have a TMS, then you are dependent on the services and the roadmap of your TMS provider. And then it's a different path altogether. So what we also do is we also partner with certain TMS players so that that service could be extended to the corporates. But yes, it could be, but again, it depends on the agility, I would say, of the corporate and the need that they are able to. So if you are able to link it to a business problem statement, then it becomes a no-brainer. Right? So then it becomes, this is something that needs to happen, right? So the problem statement becomes the crux of the matter here.
Yeah. No, so it's quite interesting. And where do APIs create the biggest business impact for treasurers? Is it in cash visibility, real-time payment, risk management, anywhere else?
I would say all the areas that you mentioned, but let me take it corporate-wise. So if you are a multi-geography corporate with, say, 500 bank accounts, something like that, and you are operating in some 40-plus geographies, for you, cash visibility, cash positioning, that becomes your number 1 item. So what you are looking for is how I, as a corporate, on demand, get access to information across all my bank accounts at the time I want and in the format that I want, right? So for those kind of corporate segments, the cash positioning and visibility becomes the top use case. Then comes a second segment, which I would say uni-geography, localized domestic corporates who want to leverage more on fraud prevention and also avail instant payment. So a combination of verification of pay, SCT Inst payout, SEPA Inst payout, that becomes a very important aspect. Then comes a third cluster, so to say, where the corporates are in the business of FX-related hedging, and they would like to have frequent FX related for their cross-border transactions. So this is where a third area, I would put it, the third cluster of corporates, where on-demand information around FX-related services become important. And all the three, we see equal traction.
Yeah, but when you talk about real-time treasury, you mentioned FX, you mentioned, let's say, balance of accounts. So do you think that API will enable people to check several times a day their management, their cash management or cash position, and maybe forcing to have several time management of your excess cash? Because if you are, especially with instant payments, so during the day, if you are a merchant, you will, let's say, have a lot of income. So what you've done at 10 maybe will be not right anymore at noon and at 4. So
Yes.
we can imagine to have many, let's
much
say...
faster and much more, I would say, much more real time.
But several action a day, I mean, not...
Several times a day, and that would also help corporate to write some programs on their site or logic or algorithms that could help synthesize this real-time information.
Yeah, because we can imagine to have a 24/7, let's say, treasury management. Because it's not because Luxembourg is banking holidays or Independence Day that you cannot continue to make some placement. Again, machine could automate. FX with Cantox, we know that currency management automation, it's clearly a good example of things that could be done by machine 24/7. But is it something that will be the future? And the next question, how to get remuneration for your cash? Because if you have excess cash during these days, it's possible to get a return on your excess cash.
Return on the excess cash, and in fact that I would link it to my next slide, and it's perfect because you're asking questions which link to the overall slide, because it's eventually, when you talk about the future, it's getting that intelligence. The way I hear your questions, it's all about getting that information and pieces of things together, at least to be able to decide that where to move money, when to move money. Yeah. And tomorrow, when tokenization and all those things happen, it would take things to the next level. But I leave that for another time for discussion. But the idea here is how to achieve that intelligence and at scale, right? So to imagine APIs as a medium where you could connect from the various players and ecosystem to have a very robust operating body, right? And that is something that, in fact, I put it as one of the last things. The future of modern treasury that we are talking about. A modern treasury which is 24/7, modern treasury which is smart, something which would help treasury evolve from a cost and control unit to a more strategic and profit and risk optimization unit, right? So for all of that, API would act as a nervous system. Just like a nervous system acts in the body, it connects the various parts so that you're able to think, you're able to sense and act. Yeah. Right? So an API becomes the heart of it, just to have that ability to connect and interconnectedness.
Yeah. So because it's good to have access to the information, the data, but if you cannot make use of these pieces of information, that
would be the next step, naturally, to move that. You're able to act on it, and then the receiving party is able to act on it too. Yeah.
And so it's quite important to have the tool because we need a sophisticated tool to make sure that we can make use of the data. And so just to talk about what could be some of the use cases. You mentioned one with the claim of insurance company, but could you give some example? Because I understood that from these co-creation cases, one-to-one, so when it works, are you replicating the model to other customers, or
absolutely.
It becomes a product?
Yeah, absolutely. So in this co-creation, and let me talk about something that we did a couple of years ago for international payment for Swift JPI. It's Benny Tracker, which was co-created with L'Oreal. I am sure some of you may have heard for it. So what it does is, with one corporate, it was started that international payment. Yes, it is a pain point. But what becomes bigger is when your beneficiary, which is receiving the international payment, is asking you that, how do I track it? Right? So which is where with L'Oreal and BNP, we got together under Treasury Lab, and we co-created Benny Tracker, which sends a link to the beneficiary. And once you click on that link, you can see where exactly your payment is. Right? So whether it has left the payer bank, whether it is with your bank, and you are awaiting to be credited. So this is something that starts with one corporate, and then we form a cluster of corporates with similar needs, and then it becomes a full-fledged product.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because you underline the fact that when you select a bank, you need to pay attention to this, let's say, technology aspect, just to make sure that they will deliver. And so a lot of relationships sometimes are built on history or legacy. And more when we reselect banks, this technology side could be considered and contemplated. So thanks a lot. I think that it's time to move to the last presentation. Thanks a lot, Lipta.